Good afternoon. My name is Colleen Phillips. I'm a case coordinator with the Special Education Surrogate Parent Program. We hope that you've all enjoyed participating in the conference thus far. This afternoon's breakout session is the Department of Children and Families, DCF, Education Policies, and Current Issues. So I hope you're in the right forum. Any questions that you have throughout the presentation can be listed in the chat forum. Jim will be addressing all questions at the end of the presentation. We just need to ensure that he can get through the entire presentation, as we do have a time limitation. So at this time, I would like to introduce our presenter, Jim Morrison. Jim has worked as the DCF Education Manager since January of 2020. Prior to that, he served as the Education Coordinator at the Cambridge area office for 3 years. And Jim's also taught and served as an administrator in several public school systems during his career. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jim.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to do the best I can in terms of getting through this. I will just give everyone an advance warning. Sometimes I do freeze on Zoom, so if I do freeze, someone please just give me a shout out. The topic for today is DCF Education Policies and current issues. So we'll try to get through the policies relatively quickly because I think most people are kind of interested in more of the current issues. So that being said, yeah, thanks for having me. I was part of this panel presentation last year, and it's great to be back. So moving forward, just quick DCF overview. We have 29 area offices. They're spread geographically throughout the state. Each office has an area director, 2 program managers, and they report right to the area director. Each office is broken down into various units, different categories, intake, adolescent, etc. Each unit has a supervisor who reports to the area program manager. And then for my work, most importantly, each area office has a lead agency, and the lead agency is embedded within the area office. They have a family networks director. There's 2 or 3 service coordinators who make referrals mostly for support and stabilization services for students in foster care. And then the primary person that I have interaction with in the lead agencies and in the DCF area offices are the education coordinators. And I know we have a lot of special ed surrogate parents out there. And, you probably have a close coordination with a lot of the ed coordinators in the various area offices. These are folks whose primary responsibility is to be the liaison between the DCF personnel in their area office and the school districts in each area office's catchment area. So, a lot of mediation skills for an education coordinator, and they really help the DCF staff kind of navigate the various educational laws and requirements that are in existence, so that everything can kind of run smoothly or as smooth as possible for students who enter foster care to have their educational needs met. So that's the overview. In terms of ed policy, DCF does have its own education policy. A lot of people don't know that. It covers students ages 6 through 22. There's a link to it. It's about 37 pages long if people are interested in checking it out. I pulled out some general policies and procedures for students in custody, as well as some information on best interest determinations, information on establishing the educational decision maker, and then, of course, appointment of special ed surrogate parents. So I pulled some things out of the 37-page policy that we'll go over in this seminar. The one thing I will say is that it was last revised in 2014, and I think at some point, hopefully during my tenure, we're going to revise it again, and we'll be looking for input in terms of all the various stakeholders to give us some ideas on what might go into it. There are some gaps in it. We don't have anything on homeschooling, and so we're working on a guidance for that. So, but 2014 is an interesting year in that the way things evolved, ESSA was passed in 2015, and so we'll get into that. We'll get into the history a little bit as well. So moving forward, the general policies, kind of the big picture of the DCF Ed policy. I hate to read to you, but I'll just do that a little bit in this beginning part of the presentation. The department expects and will support through its policies and work with families, children to be prepared to enter school, to be attending regularly and on time, to be making educational progress, to be benefiting from extracurricular activities and supports as they are available and suited to them, and to graduate high school with a plan for post-secondary education training and/or employment. Pretty straightforward. The post-secondary piece is interesting in that there's a whole transition plan that goes with students who go through who are involved with DCF up and through graduation. The big buzzword that we kind of work with, and the thing that we strive for, is education stability for students in foster care, and really for all of our highly mobile students. So we're looking to promote educational stability through our ed policy. So for children who enter department care or custody, the department promotes educational continuity, and educational setting and placement stability is central to improving educational outcomes and fostering positive educational experiences. Meeting these challenges requires the department to do the following: set high expectations for all children and youth, identify and meet the individual needs of each student, and then partner effectively with families, and that includes foster and pre-adoptive family resources, students, schools, childcare, early education, and all other community-based programs, all of the people who are important in making sure that students can be successful in school. In the ed policy, there are some key principles that DCF articulates for supporting educational achievement. It's not just enough to have students go to school and attend. We want them to achieve. We want to meet the level of success that they can strive for. So high quality early childhood education, especially for at-risk and low-income children, is critical to later school and life success. That foundational support, very important. Engaging families in their support systems as partners is vital to children's educational attainment. Educational stability and continuity are key to maintaining critical relationships and academic attainment for department children and youth. Some more key principles: children benefit from participating in educational programming in the least restrictive environment. There's that IDEA standard that meets a range of academic and social needs, and receiving academic credit for the work that they do. Children who enter department care or custody deserve to have the same access to education support services as children not in department care or custody, and to have full and complete records of their educational experiences and attainments maintained, utilized, and planning to meet their needs and provided to them or their caregivers when they leave. So the idea that students should have access to their records. Children benefit from the involvement of a caring adult who's consistently attentive to their educational strengths and needs and provides continuous supportive guidance at key junctures, whether or not they're in department care or custody. And fortunately, if you're attending this conference, you're probably descriptive of that last bullet point. So we're fortunate to have a lot of people working with the department who kind of fill that role as the caring adult. So the next key piece of the ed policy is the educational decision maker. You hear the acronym EDM. There's lots of acronyms in the DCF world and in the DESE world. So the question that pops up all the time: who is the EDM? Who is the educational decision maker when dealing with a student in foster care? And the answer is it depends. It depends on what the situation is for the particular student. So in this scenario, we have like a voluntary placement agreement in DCF custody, or a CRA, a child requiring assistance. So if the student is in that category, the parent retains the right and responsibility to make decisions related to special education. So, if it's a CRA or a voluntary placement agreement, there's no issues regarding neglect or abuse. There's just an agreement with the department that, the student is going to come into the department custody. Then the parents are going to retain special education decision-making rights. And so that's kind of important to know in those circumstances. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I think you can kind of figure it out. The second area of how to identify the educational decision maker would be the students in DCF custody and the students placed with a foster family. And so, reading through this, when a child is in the legal custody of DCF through an order of either the juvenile or probate court and family court, is living in a foster home, and DCF determines that the child's parent should not continue in the role of educational decision maker, the DCF social worker will request the child's foster parent to act in this role unless a conflict of interest is identified. And Megan Ronzio, through the Special Ed Surrogate Parent Program, when I first started as an education coordinator in Cambridge, she kind of walked me through this and said, hey, the expectation, is the foster parent is going to be the EDM. As a foster parent is going to be someone who's going to be going to the IEP meetings and signing off on the IEP and making educational decisions. And so it just kind of makes sense if the placement is suitable for a child to live, then the foster parent's going to take on that responsibility as education decision maker. So in those cases, we don't have DCF make a referral to the Special Ed Surrogate Parent Program unless there's a conflict of interest, and those are very rare. And then the third category, then the one that most of you guys are probably familiar with regards to, hey, who is that educational decision maker, is the student is in DCF custody and they're placed in congregate care, meaning either a group home or a residential school. And when that scenario takes place and DCF determines, hey, that the parent can't really continue as the EDM, DCF will seek the appointment of an SESP to make special education decisions on behalf of the child. And that's, that relationship that DCF has with the Special Ed Surrogate Parent Program is really important. And, the communication that Megan and Colleen and, all the fine people who work at the SESP program have with, not just myself, but all the education coordinators and all of the 29 area offices, and making sure that the procedures and protocols are followed, and that an appointment can be made in a timely manner. And, sometimes there are requests that DCF will make on the SESP program saying, hey, we really need someone quick because we have a meeting coming up. And, more often than not, they're able to help us out. So it's very much appreciated, as is the fact that it's very much appreciated that so many quality people who, volunteer their time to become special ed surrogate parents and really make a difference advocating on behalf of the students. So that's something that, is really important, and it really, helps students who are foster kids in the system to have that caring and educated and informed adult serving as SESPs, critical. So, when there is an appointment made, who does the SESP work with at DCF? Well, the SESP should work with the student's ongoing caseworker. Each kid in custody has a caseworker, and with the office's education coordinator. And so there should be good dialogue between the three regarding all educational issues. So the DCF caseworkers and the education coordinators and all the area offices should make every effort to keep SESPs updated on the status of their students' cases. SESPs should be included on all education-related correspondence. CC the SESPs, and asked to participate in best interest discussions. We'll talk about those a little bit later on. School districts should be reminded by DCF education coordinators to keep the SESPs in the loop on education-related matters. If a district isn't doing that, then they're not going to be able to move forward in terms of, working through team meetings or getting IEPs signed, because the SESPs are the decision makers in those cases. So these are all things that are just common sense things, but this is how the system works. We might have some new SESPs, joining us at this conference. I know the recruitment is big. So, this is how the situation, how the circumstances would work. In terms of communication can be tough. It can be tough these days in particular. There's very few in-person meetings going on. Everyone's expected to be available all the time, kind of in this current environment. But nevertheless, from a DCF standpoint, it's very difficult kind of navigating the role of a typical DCF caseworker in this environment. So the idea that communication can be difficult given the intense caseload of each DCF worker and the complexities of the schedules of all interested parties. Nevertheless, even in the current environment, it's expected that that collaterals will respond to inquiries by SESPs in a timely manner. So if an SESP has an issue with a student, has a educational issue, a concern, please bring it forward, and the caseworker, the supervisor, the ed coordinator should get back to you. If the education coordinator does not respond after repeated efforts, contact the lead director in the area office. If the DCF caseworker does not respond after repeated efforts, contact the DCF's worker's supervisor. Like I said, every worker has a supervisor. So, we're trying to promote, really solid communication going forward, and it's just vital in this day and age. So that kind of concludes the pieces of the ed policy that I wanted to highlight, that exists for DCF. And now we'll segue a little bit into some other things. And the first thing I would like to kind of touch upon is ESSA. ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act, as most people probably know. It was a bipartisan piece of federal legislation, and it provided guidelines for states to assure educational stability for students in foster care. Now, to be fair, the foster care education part is like a tiny element of ESSA. ESSA really is, the federal law that goes back to the Johnson administration, when the federal government really started getting involved in public education, and we've had various variations of it. The one before ESSA, as you guys probably know, was No Child Left Behind under the Bush administration, high stakes testing, all, high standards, all of these different things. And unfortunately, the mandates on the school districts and teachers and administrators and everyone said, hey, we need to revise this. And so that was the bipartisan nature that existed. There were, liberal Democrats who had reasons not to like No Child Left Behind. There were conservative Republicans who didn't like elements of it. So the idea that there needed to be some new federal legislation. And so that is why ESSA got passed, and it backed off on the high stakes testing a little bit and some of the unfunded mandates that were hurting the states. So, nevertheless, the pieces in foster care, the pieces of ESSA that relate to foster care, amazingly, in my view, really match up quite nicely with our ed policy that was in existence before ESSA. As usual, with any new piece of legislation, it takes a little while to try to get accustomed to it. So DCF and DESE had kind of a joint committee on how to work through the ESSA requirements. And by 2018, beginning of that year, DCF and DESE issued a joint memorandum on how ESSA would be implemented. So going forward, one of the things that was in the DCF Ed policy and is highlighted in that DCF DESE memorandum are best interest determinations. And so you hear the term BID, another acronym, but a best interest determination takes place anytime a student in DCF custody moves from one placement to another. Okay, so the BID, this determination, this discussion, should be initiated by DCF. It should be initiated either by the caseworker or the education coordinator, is sometimes used as the facilitator, and you need to schedule like a meeting. And so the participants in the BID must include the foster care point of contact from DCF, as well as the foster care point of contact from the school district of origin and the local district where the student is now living. So the student moved, maybe went from a group home to a foster home, or vice versa, or from one foster home to another. So all these folks need to be invited to this particular meeting. And you might say, okay, well, if I'm a special ed surrogate parent, do I need to go? I would say yes. And so the other participants, the third piece of this slide, other participants may include the lead's education coordinator, who oftentimes will facilitate the meeting, the student's education decision maker, the SPED directors from the respective school districts, and the students' parents. And one of the things that DCF has been stressing is that even if parents don't have custody, most parents get custody back. We want to keep them in the loop. So the more people you can invite to this best interest determination, the better. And everyone should be able to work kind of collectively to try and figure out, what the next step should be for a student. So there's only one question. Sometimes this gets confused because people bring more into a best interest determination that needs to be there. the one question is, will the student remain in his or her school of origin, the school they're presently attending, or will the student be enrolled locally? That's it. There's nothing else beyond that question. So bids are about enrollment. They're not about placement. Okay. So, how do you determine that? Well, it depends. It depends on the situation for the student. And there are a multitude of factors that you should examine, when making that decision as to whether the student will stay put in his or her school of origin or be enrolled locally. DESE has a great set of guidelines for bids. School districts often will bring these to best interest determinations and kind of check them off. They're not required, but you can think of it: the age of the student, the special education considerations of the student, the distance to and from school. There are all kinds of things that would go into what makes up the appropriate answer to the question. So I would encourage people to kind of look at that, even if you're not going to. Most people here attending this conference aren't going to be the foster care points of contact, but you might be invited to a bid at some point, and it'd be good to kind of take a look at some of the things that need to be considered, when making that decision. So the key, and then the key word we'll hear in a lot of these issues is in fact collaboration. So decisions about whether a student in foster care should continue to attend the school of origin should be made collaboratively by DCF, the student, especially if the student's a little older, the student's family and or foster family, and if different, the person authorized to make educational decisions on behalf of the student, the EDM, the school and district of origin, and when different, the local district where the student is placed. And these parties should have the opportunity to participate meaningfully in the decision-making process. Everyone should be able to voice their opinion on this question. Best interest determination should focus on the needs of each individual student, take into account a variety of factors. Every effort should be made to reach an agreement regarding the appropriate school placement of a student in foster care. So everyone's voices should in fact be heard. Now, at the end of the day, if all these reasonable people get together and they agree to disagree, then DCF has final say. DCF will finalize the best interest determination. I can tell you cases where that takes place, few and far between. And so, for most of the time, people can kind of talk this out and decide, hey, collectively, what's in the best interest. If there's just no resolution, then DCF does have the final say, but that, is used very sparingly. Okay. So that's best interest determinations. And if you have any questions on any of this stuff, at the end of the presentation, certainly we'll take questions. One of the other things that was, apparent in ESSA and then was reiterated by the folks who worked on the joint memorandum between DCF and DESE was immediate enrollment. And, if it is in the best interest of a student in foster care to leave the school of origin, the student must be enrolled in the local school district immediately. All right. That's a picture of Needham High School. That's where I live and my kids go to school. So I figured I'd be safe using that. But the idea is that enrollment needs to take place regardless of any outstanding documents immediately. So to minimize the disruption of the student's education, ESSA requires the district to enroll the student in a new school right away without waiting to receive the typical student enrollment documentation other than emergency contact information. The enrolling school must immediately contact the child's school and district of origin to obtain the relevant records and documentation, and the school and district of origin should immediately transfer those records. So this needs to happen right away. And so this is one of the issues that was popping up before ESSA was that, hey, yeah, okay, we're going to enroll locally, but you don't have the records. We need the birth certificate, we need the IEP, we need the transcripts, and all this stuff. No, you got to enroll. Let's get the kid situated, in school. Let's find an appropriate placement in that new district, and if the records trickle in later on, fine. So that's important to know, in my view. And then last but not least, transportation. And transportation is it's a big issue right now. Some might say it's a kind of a headache. We can talk a little bit about that going forward. So Some students in foster care will need transportation to remain in their schools of origin. Districts of origin must collaborate with DCF to implement clear written procedures governing how transportation will be provided and arrange to ensure that students in foster care who need transportation to remain in their school of origin will receive such transportation while they're in foster care. Districts and DCF are encouraged to consider a variety of options for providing the necessary transportation in each case. Transportation, it's a right for students who are homeless and in foster care, and it needs to be provided by the school district. Okay. Someone might say, well, what about COVID? Transportation companies are hurting. They're laying off drivers. They didn't operate for most of the spring, and definitely sympathetic towards that. That being said, the right to transportation still remains. And so, I think that's important to kind of note as we segue in this conversation going forward, to kind of keep in mind it's an issue, right now, but it's an issue that needs to be that people need to keep in mind that it's still right. And DESE feels very strongly on that as well. Okay. So, just segueing a little bit, moving away from policy. Obviously, when COVID-19 hit in mid-March, there were lots of challenges that accompanied it. And so, what I'd like to do is just take a couple minutes and talk about, what were some of those challenges. I think we can identify those fairly easily. And then, what has been done? What kind of responses have taken place to ensure the best possible outcomes for students in foster care and for all of our highly mobile or vulnerable students. So for students in DCF custody, obviously COVID-19, the crisis has been particularly challenging. We've worked with DESE around special education equity issues for highly mobile students during this time. Some might argue that there have been some positive things that have come out of COVID. We're all much better using technology right now. I think we're more responsive. When someone sends us a message, you're on all the time, so you need to get back to them, via email. I think one of the things that has resulted because of the current environment is that DESE and DCF communicate much more frequently than they did previously. So I'm part of the education stability team that is run by DESE, and I have a standing meeting every Friday with you guys might know Sarah Slaughterback, Kristen McKinnon, Christine Cowan, all folks who work hard at DESE to make sure that educational issues regarding our highly mobile students are addressed. And so we just have a standing meeting. We go over cases, we go over policies, procedures, and we're working better as a result of the pandemic. So hopefully that continues beyond this current climate. DESE's educational stability team, the group that I just talked about, issued tip sheets both in April and August that included guidance for those dealing with students in foster care during the COVID-19 crisis. It also included guidance for dealing with homeless students and then migrant and military students as well. And so these tip sheets have been the feedback I've gotten, very useful to education coordinators, special ed surrogate parents. Do best interest determinations continue? What about enrollment? How do we support technological needs for students who are doing remote learning? All of these things were kind of part of this guidance, and I think it provided some structure going forward in terms of helping address the needs of our students during COVID-19. So like I said, the tip sheet topics: enrollment, school of origin, best interest determinations, how do we connect with students in foster care? These are all things that went into that. And the tip sheet is available. I have key links at the end so people can access it if they want to, but it was kind of a joint DESE DCF effort. Congregate care, so kids who are in residential schools and kids who are in group homes, a lot of concerns of those students once March hit, once the pandemic hit. How do we get those kids to engage in remote learning? Because as we all know, everyone was doing remote learning last spring. From March 13th to June 20th, whatever the end of the year was, every student in the Commonwealth was doing remote learning. So how do you do remote learning in a group home? How do you engage students? And so what we tried to do was we tried to take an account as to how well remote learning was doing, how successful was it in group homes for the most part. And so the special ed circuit parents did a survey. I had the education coordinators conduct a survey, an inquiry, and they came up with various results. The ARC and LEAD teams in the area offices, the DCF area offices, they wanted to accumulate information on their students in congregate care. They wanted to figure out, hey, what's their level of engagement? Get some feedback from various sources. Was it positive? Was it mixed? Was it negative? How are the students engaging in remote learning? This is the data that we came up. We had 703 students in congregate care, mostly positive. And again, it's not a scientific survey by any means. We had some anecdotal evidence that some kids liked remote learning better. But at the same time, you've got 25%, a little over 25% of the reporting back was that it was mixed or it was negative. And so, consequently, how do we improve the educational output of students who are in congregate care during this time period? And so, that led us to kind of come up with a list in terms of, some of the issues. You guys are all familiar with these issues: technology, lack of sufficient staff, communication issues, assignments, clarity, problems with going back and forth, and what's the expectation of the teacher regarding a remote assignment. Some of the programs had rules against technology use, and so consequently those had to be kind of addressed and loosened up with the congregate care programs. We had students who just say, hey, school's not to be taken seriously if it's done remotely. How do you motivate those students? And then we've had lots of outbreaks at placements. We've had quarantines, we've had COVID-19 outbreaks. And so, how do you facilitate remote learning at a group home if you're also dealing with students who are infected? And so we had, obviously regression and failure to make sufficient progress. These are all things that were reported back out. This isn't unique to congregate care. You could probably make an argument that all of these things affected all students throughout the Commonwealth, but our charge is to deal with the students in foster care. These are the things that were identified. Okay. So, armed with all this knowledge, the DESE certainly was armed with all this knowledge and issues relating to, how school went the last quarter of the year. As you guys all know, there were many guidances that were issued. I would say probably June through August by DESE. A lot of thoughtful, in my view, part of my job, I had to read through many of them. A lot of thoughtful work went into a lot of these, a lot of efforts by a lot of people to try and provide guidance in various categories so that school could reopen in the fall. And so, the fall reopening guidance, and then all these other areas. And, a lot of information, just a lot of information to try and comprehend in a relatively short period of time. I mean, like I said, DESE dropped these guidances, from June through August. And so, how do you prepare for this next school year? And so you guys probably all have this page bookmarked on your computers, and we're constantly checking it and looking for various updates. And so, DESE has done that. So once these guidances started dropping, one of the things that I started talking about with my counterparts at DESE is, how do we get a handle on the start of the reopening for the school year? And so one of the things that we decided to do was that prior to school starting, we're going to have meetings between the DCF area offices and the school districts, and myself and Sarah Slaughterback and Christine Cowan and Kristen McKinnon, we're going to facilitate them. So try to make sure that all the players in the various districts are aware of one another with their DCF counterparts. And, we wanted to know, what's the school reopening plan for the district? What, are some of the issues that you're identifying that are going to be problematic going forward? Because we knew there were going to be problems. So, between August 10th and September 1st, we conducted school reopening meetings with all of the 29 DCF area office and just hundreds of districts across the Commonwealth. And, they ranged from about an hour to an hour and a half long. And we looked at, what were going to be the school reopening plans in each individual district, and then the policies and procedures related to the education of foster students for the upcoming year, and, other highly mobile students, homeless, migrant, military. So I believe that those meetings proved very fruitful. And I'm not saying that like the start of this school year has gone, without any problems. We obviously know there are lots of issues, but I think this helped alleviate them in a way that, at least the lines of communication were open between the folks at DCF and the folks in the school districts. So we're going to do an update in January and February, probably between the two vacations, if the vacations are still going on. And we're going to try to get a status update from the districts on their plans for the remainder of the year. And then again, go through some of the main issues that confront all of us for dealing with the education of our students, particularly the foster students, because that's the group that I'm charged with dealing with. So that's ongoing. So that's one of the things that we in fact did. Another thing that we did to try and promote, educational stability and just a smoother process when there would be problems, is that we had all the education coordinators load data into a Google Docs spreadsheet. And it includes, the spreadsheet has 3 pages. The first page has the school reopening plans for all the districts and in their catchment area. So if you were wondering, hey, what's going on in Holyoke, what's going on in Hudson, what's going on in Lawrence, what's going down in Bourne, you can check on this spreadsheet and it will have, what the school reopening plan is, really quickly. I think even more importantly, the second and third tabs have key contacts for the school districts, the foster care points of contact, the SPED supervisors, SPED directors, the out of district coordinators. And then for the DCF area office, the foster care point of contact, the education coordinator, the lead director, the area resource coordinator. And so all that information is available in one spot. So the feedback we've been getting is that that's been very useful to help people communicate more effectively, because as we know, foster students could be sent anywhere throughout the state. They're not necessarily, just because a student is in the coastal DCF area office, it doesn't mean that student's going to be placed in that region. That student could be placed in the Worcester area, or couldn't be placed out in Western Mass or down the Cape. So they're all different placements throughout the state. And so the idea that all the contacts are in one particular place, I think is good. This Google Doc is open to the public. We have it posted on our DCF website, and you could just copy and paste this link. It's just a spreadsheet on my computer, and you can certainly access it. And I think it might be useful for SESPs as well. So what are some of the beyond like what we did to try and alleviate some of the COVID challenges? What are some of the issues now that we see popping up as a result of the current environment? So one of them is compensatory services. And so we know that probably every student in the Commonwealth could make a case that they need compensatory services as a result of what's happened since March. DESE issued a great guidance on compensatory services, and they made it clear that the term compensatory services to mean any services a student with an IEP requires to make up for the impact on a student of the interruptions caused by temporary school closures and suspension of in-person instruction related to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is not compensatory services that you would hear about as a result of a BSEA hearing. It's not that. The guidance makes it clear, hey, it's COVID-19 compensatory services. So one of the interesting things is DESE's guidance includes key questions, clarification of particular services a student might need, information for students who turned 22 during COVID-19, kind of like a gray area, and a step-by-step process for determining compensatory services. If you haven't read that guidance, I would encourage you to read it. Go to the desktop link, find it. It's really important. And one of the reasons why it's important is that foster students have been prioritized for compensatory services. So DESE issued guidance that addresses compensatory services for special education students as a result of COVID-19, like we just talked about. The department, DESE, recommends prioritizing the scheduling of IEP meetings to discuss COVID compensatory services for several student populations, including students in foster care or congregate care. So DESE has said, hey, that's one of the groups that we should prioritize for compensatory services, students in foster care. Okay, it doesn't mean they automatically that all foster students are going to go to the top of the list, but they've identified them, and I think that's important. I think it needs to be kind of out there. Another kind of interesting area that we've kind of delved into over the past few months in the special education guidance. DESE, it urged districts prioritize in-person learning for students who have significant and complex needs. And then they established criteria to meet the set significant and complex standard. Got to have a high needs in the IEP identified. And then there were, I think you had to meet two other base pieces of criteria. One was being a foster student. The interesting thing, one of the things that we learned as we were doing these school reopening meetings, in August, that many school districts were including students in foster care as part of their high needs population. So they weren't necessarily saying they were significant and complex, but they're saying, hey, they're high needs, and thus we're going to put them in the category of having more access to in-person learning than might otherwise be available. Some of you might have heard that, my wife's a teacher. She's a kindergarten teacher in Dedham. Because she's considered an essential worker, one of my children has the ability to go to school all the time because we're in a town where it's hybrid, because she's a child of a teacher. So there are different little contingencies that exist that you see in some of these guidances. This one was kind of like one that popped up just as we learned about the reopening plans for the districts. And so the interesting thing is it's a district by district basis. So DESE's clarified that this designation for students in foster care is done on a district by district basis. It's important to find out if in fact this designation exists for students on a case by case basis. And it can often, the information can often be found on the district websites where school reopening plans are posted. But also if you have some question about that, reach out to the ed coordinator, reach out to the caseworker, because they're kind of aware of this. So it was interesting the way some districts approached it. They said, hey, foster care, you're part of this population that can go all the time in person. This is one that gets people a little bit fired up, and I can understand why. So one of the things that played itself out as the school year was starting was, okay, the districts have their plans. Pretty much every district said if a student chooses, or if the parents choose to have their students stay home for remote only, they can certainly do that. So that was a choice given to parents. But what about kids who are in foster care? What about a kid in a group home? And so DCF basically made the point that this decision about whether a student goes in person, whether the student goes hybrid, or whether the student is just exclusively remote, is an educational decision. And there has been some pushback on that. Some people have said, well, yeah, but it's also a health and safety decision. And so our stance is that type of learning format is an educational decision. And though it's strongly recommended that all stakeholders participate in educational discussions regarding students in foster care, it's the student's educational decision maker who has the ultimate say as to whether a student attends school remotely, in person, or in a hybrid manner. So then revert back, okay? So it'd be the foster parent who would make that decision. if a kid is in a foster home, right? If it's a CRA, it's the parent. If it's a student in a group home, it is in fact the special ed surrogate parent who's going to make that decision. And some people said, well, hey, that's a tough thing to put on someone who who's doing this as a volunteer. But at the same time, I guess my response is, I trust the special ed surrogate parents, to make that decision, because at the end of the day, remote and hybrid and in person, you can say that it's all learning. They are different, and I trust the special ed surrogate parent to look at the educational needs of the particular student and make that judgment as to which format the student needs to be enrolled in. And so that's something that's popped up. Hopefully that hasn't caused too much dissension along the way, but nevertheless, the DCF stance is it's the EDM, it's the education decision maker who makes this decision. And who would have thought that this question would even come up just a short time ago, but it's one that's popped up quite a bit. Other things to be aware of just going forward, ESY in summer school. I can't believe we're already talking about that, but my kids are done through the first quarter of high school. ESY services were provided this past summer by districts. Summer school is available on a district-to-district basis. Majority of ESY services in summer school were done remotely. There was some guidance in around, for ESY anyway, who should be eligible for in-person. So students who were considered high priority were eligible for in-school ESY services. I think this is a big thing to monitor going forward. You throw in the compensatory services. This is something that we should be looking forward towards the end of the school year, and we'll see if DESE has anything further on this. I imagine they would. And then kind of last but not least, this whole idea of recruiting issues during remote learning. There's been so much written and said about this, in recent weeks and months. And so I think a lot of thoughtful discussions have been brought forward regarding this. One of the things DCF tried to do at the end of last school year, we developed a tip sheet, DCF tip sheet for educators on how to deal with students who are in foster care during remote learning. And it had I think some good common sense techniques on checking in with students. And then the other thing is how do you fulfill your responsibilities as a mandated reporter when all your students are learning remotely? And so it gave some guidance on, hey, how do you still be a mandated reporter when you're not seeing the kids in person, but actually you're, as a teacher, you're getting new insights into their homes that you'd never seen before. So, well-intentioned, and at the same time, people have brought up, hey, there are some equity issues in that. The Globe did some really interesting reporting over the summer about, school districts reporting parents to DCF for kids who were missing classes and things along those lines. And, from a socioeconomic standpoint, from a racial diversity standpoint, is there inherent discrimination that exists within, remote learning? And, I think we would all probably argue that, yeah, there is, there's problems in regular learning. So, but when you factor in, all of the technology and the access, and the struggles that parents have, just dealing with students who are, have these conflicting schedules and accessing and utilizing technology and Wi-Fi, all these things that, weren't even on the radar screen for us for a long period, a short period of time ago, now are central to our students' learning. There's definitely going to be some equity issues. So we've been working with DESE, and DESE is doing a very good job, I think, developing some new guidance. I think it's going to come out relatively soon. A lot of eyes have been on it, on how to promote safety and well-being at the same time, be considerate to equity issues, for students during this era, during this time period. So I'd look for that. We are working together on that. The last thing I'd kind of recommend in this realm would be, a lot of you guys probably read this article in the October 5th issue of the New Yorker, Schools Out, Alec McGillis. He just kind of examines many of these topics through the experiences of a 12-year-old boy, I think it was Shamar, in Baltimore. And then there's some historical context in the story as well, about, the history of education and the importance of public education, I think. And it also has some medical elements to it as well, in terms of, did we really do the right thing by closing down all the schools during the pandemic? And obviously politics plays a role in this as well. So I couldn't recommend that enough. That's the, I put in the link for it as well. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely check it out. It's very thought provoking. We're all trying, we're all stressed, we're all busy, but I think it's good to read things that, relate to some of the things that we're dealing with on an everyday basis. For all of these issues, I'd say that, there's no easy solution. There's no easy answers. I'd hope that, people who are, taking the time to participate and listen in on this conference, that they're all about communication, collaboration, cooperation. We're all trying the best to meet the needs of our students during these trying times. If I can be of any help going forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is there. I get, special ed surrogate parents, a lot of cases, shooting me emails and bringing stuff to my attention. And I do bring them forward in the meetings that I'm in, particularly meetings with DESE, so that, you can never have enough information. So people like Pat Grennan and some of the other special ed surrogate parents can't appreciate your help enough and your work enough with all of these students. So I'm hoping everyone's kind of still with me. And at that point, that kind of wraps up my little presentation. If there are any questions, or if you want to just kind of have a discussion or a dialogue going forward, I'd be happy to do that.
Jim, you have many questions in the Q&A section. If you click down on the bottom of Zoom, can you see them?
I'm trying.
Okay, so I can go through them with you.
Okay. I can't get back on Zoom for some reason. Oh, wait a minute.
Just at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button.
Yeah, I see that.
If you click,
okay.
Just open.
Yeah, 15. Wow.
Yeah, and the one that's answered is actually not answered. So there's 16, because I just stated that there was a great question and that you'd be answering questions at the end of your presentation.
Yeah. So I'm looking, let's see. What support does DCF provide for transition age clients? There's a whole process that exists for students who are going to transition out of DCF, and the caseworker, supervisor, even up to the area director, they're involved in that. If the student, there's also the track where the student goes on a 688 path as well, so that happens as well. But yeah, there's a whole procedure and protocol that they follow for kids who are transitioning out of DCF. One of the issues that comes up time and time again is students who turn 18, they're not protected by the ESSA guidelines any longer. And so we're working with DESE to try and get some better answers, whether we can apply some McKinney-Vento legislation to kids who turn 18. But yeah, there is a whole process. I can't go into it verbatim, but there definitely is. Anonymous viewer, is there a protocol for education coordinator to contact the SESP or for the SESP to contact the educational coordinator? So I always think it's good practice for the SESP to reach out to the education coordinator. So that I would love it. I'd really appreciate it when I'd get an SESP who would reach out and say, hey, just so you know, I was assigned. Now the education coordinator should know that the SESP was assigned, because Megan and Colleen, you guys do a great job sending out that letter to, really in a timely fashion, showing that, hey, this person has been assigned. But, if the SESP could reach out, that'd be great. I just know as the education coordinator, it's probably not like their top priority, but they appreciate getting that. And then there should be a good, relationship going forward. So that would be my recommendation. Reach out to the educational coordinator if you're the SESP. I'd like to hear guidance about how, when, how often, in what circumstances the SESP should interact with the child's parents. I'm especially interested in this guidance for situations when DCF's goal for the family is reunification, but the current situation is contentious. Emily Frank. Thanks, Emily. That's a tough one. I mean, that is a very difficult one. There are SESPs who do interact with the child's parents. It should probably be done through the caseworkers. The goal is reunification, almost all the time. So we want to keep the parents. We want to keep the parents in the loop. We also don't want to put any SESPs in a contentious situation. So I would work diligently with the caseworkers, with the individual caseworkers in the individual cases to work through that. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea. I think most, parents do in fact appreciate the fact that someone is advocating for their children, and advocating in a manner that really could be modeled for the parents. So, I would encourage, before an IEP meeting, for example, to maybe have a little brainstorming session as to, what the strategy is going into the IEP meeting, and include the parents in that dialogue. So I can't do that, but every case is different. So you just gonna have to handle it on a case by case basis. Lonnie, I apologize if I butcher anyone's name. Lonnie Burgess Radek asked, what are the qualifications for an educational director? Are they DESE licensed? They're not DESE licensed. They work for service agencies, like Riverside or Key or Communities for People, or, JRI has most of them in the southern region, mostly master's level in terms of the job description. Usually some don't necessarily have to have been an educator, but some background working with school districts, some special education background. That's usually what they're looking for, but they're not hired directly by DCF. There's some discussion down the road, maybe that the ed coordinator could be a DCF employee. We're not there yet, but those are the main things that they're looking for. I could send you, if you're interested, shoot me an email. I'll send you a typical job description. I can certainly do that. Whose responsibility is it to confirm, this anonymous viewer, that the SESP is included in updates and bids? I would say it's DCF's responsibility. DCF should facilitate the bid, and so it should be a DCF caseworker, or at least the educational coordinator in the office, to reach out to make sure that the EDM, in this case maybe the SESP, is present at the bid. Technically at the bid, all you have to have is the foster parent point of contact and the school point of contact, but it shouldn't be just done in a vacuum, especially if it's not contentious, but one where reasonable people could disagree about whether or not the student should be enrolled locally or returned to their school of origin. So you should get as many people invited as possible. So I would argue that DCF should invite the SESP, the EDM. Suzanne Remington says, in my lengthy experience as EDM for many children, bids don't always take place. And when they do, oftentimes it's only a few people communicating via email. So bids should take place anytime a student moves from one placement to another. They're not always going to be in the same format. And so consequently, if it is a fairly routine answer kids moving into a star, it's going to maintain a school of origin, bring everyone in to the email chain, and say, hey, is everyone in agreement? The kid's just going to maintain school of origin while he's at the star. It can be done via email. They can be done via email. You don't necessarily have to have everyone in a phone conference or in a Zoom or WebEx meeting. But I would say when in fact there is when there's some question, it better not be done via email, because then the process is just going to get prolonged, and the bid needs to happen relatively quickly because there are other steps that need to be taken place, particularly if the student's returning to school of origin. There's transportation issues. I mean, as enrolling locally, transportation issues, obviously placement issues. What type of educational settings is the student going to be in? So you can't be prolonging the bids forever. If the SESP cannot obtain records from the school the child has been moved to, who should they be available from? DCF? Many SPs spend a great deal of time trying to locate educational records. Should DCF be helping with this? DCF can certainly help with that. You know, school districts, they vary. I'll just be honest, they vary in terms of who they will release records to. You know, some will need a release from DCF, but if the kid is in DCF custody, you know, and the school district is demanding a release, like they won't simply just send the IEP to the ed coordinator via a phone call, which does happen as well. If they demand a release, then DCF can do that. This is like a question that really calls out for collaboration. If anyone's having trouble getting educational records, everyone should help the SESP get them. That should not be an obstacle. And so the caseworker can certainly request them from the school. The ed coordinator might have some, or the ed coordinator might have a good relationship with the SPED department in a particular district to help you with that. Anonymous viewer, regarding transportation to a school of origin, does the child in DCF care have the right to that transportation if the child does not have an IEP? As a foster parent, it is time-consuming and costly to continue to transport a child to another town, even if it is the child's best interest to remain in their school of origin. So the way S is written is that students who are in foster care have a right to transportation. It depends, you know, I don't know about the particular situation with the foster parent, how close it is. You know, oftentimes it has to be, you know, there are certain like mileage considerations that take place, and every school district has its own kind of own transportation radius, you know, where they'll provide it and where they won't. So I guess that question is depends, but students in foster care have a right to transportation. How can foster parents or SESPs access copies of tip sheets for COVID? Yeah, you can either email me and I'll get you the tip sheets, or they are on the I think at the end of my PowerPoint, there's a link to the education stability team, which I'm part of, even though it's a DESE, or, you know, it's officially a DESE group, and those are posted there as well. Anonymous viewer, education coordinators primarily work on behalf of special education students who are in DCF custody and placed in chronic care. Who at DCF is accountable for kids in custody who are on IEPs living in foster homes? Who is accountable for the education of kids in DCF custody who are not on IEPs and live in either congregate care or foster homes? So, you know, for the kids who are not on IEPs, it's the caseworkers. You know, they're the decision makers if they're in custody. So, you know, they have, you know, educational decision making rights because there's no special ed. The first part of it, who at DCF is accountable for kids in custody or on IEPs living in foster homes? The foster parent. So the foster parent is the educational decision maker, but nothing happens in a vacuum. And so, you know, the caseworker, the ed coordinator, they should all be part of, like, you know, the process. We've had some foster parents who are just incredible as educational advocates, and then there are some who need some guidance and assistance. And you know, as you guys know, going to an IEP meeting, if you haven't been to them before, is a little bit intimidating. And so, you know, any help that the education coordinator can provide to a foster parent You know, it's certainly encouraged. And so, you know, again, this is all about kind of communication collaboration. If the foster parent feels like they need some assistance, they should be reaching out to the caseworker. They should be reaching out to the education coordinator. Of the issues related to anonymous viewer, these are all great questions, by the way. Of the issues related to remote learning, what strategies do they have to help the students overcome and experience more success? Of the issues related to what strategies they have to help the students overcome. So yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, you know, in terms of remote learning, it's definitely not for everyone. One of the things I'll throw out there is, you know, just thinking about it from a congregate care perspective. The congregate care leaders have like really been concerned about remote learning because of staff shortages, strategies, you know, staff shortages that they've experienced. You know, and you know, the fact is they weren't equipped to have kids in their group homes during the day. The residential schools were fine, but obviously the group homes. So some have found some funding that was made available through various resources to hire educational liaisons. So there have been some educational liaisons that have been working now in congregate care programs in group homes to help students with remote learning. So that's, you know, kind of one thing. One of the things that's happened, at least in Massachusetts, is that a lot of the cable companies, particularly Comcast, has really stepped up to provide enhanced Wi-Fi access in many communities, particularly, you know, kind of disadvantaged areas or kind of remote areas, or might say rural areas in Western Massachusetts. I mean, we just heard horror stories about people driving to use common Wi-Fi in places like a general store out in like the Berkshires. And so we have had that happen as well. And I will say that, you know, school districts have done a really good job acquiring Chromebooks and iPads, but mostly Chromebooks, to get the technology in the hands of the students. Now, the problem that exists is for some students, you know, just merely having the technology isn't enough. And, you know, some parents aren't equipped to help them. I mean, it's hard to find the right link. I'm looking at Megan's next question. The Google Doc isn't working. I'm not sure which Google Doc she's talking about. So, but I'll definitely try to help her with that. I mean, so that, you know, there's so many frustrating situations where a kid can't get the right link to get into his particular class. And so, you know, that's something that, you know, districts really need to kind of address going forward. But I think that the issue is one where people need to communicate that they're having difficulties. And if it's kid in foster care, communicate to the caseworker, communicate to the education coordinator, so that there can be things so that there can be things put in place to help students at least access the technology that they needed. But there are so many just ancillary issues related to remote learning. It's difficult to answer that question kind of in a general way. But, you know, increased technology, definitely that's something that's happened. I mean, the districts have done a really good job procuring Chromebooks for students, so that they can access it. Megan, the link to the Google Doc isn't working. Can you let us know where to find it on the website? Oh, the Google Doc for the spreadsheet. Yeah. Yeah, it's on the DCF website, and I'll have to send it to you, Megan, and I'll send you the copy of my Google Doc. Yeah, it might not be working off of my PowerPoint, so I will send it to you. Janet Hirschhorn, sorry. Is the SCSP as EDM permitted to consider COVID safety related to in-person learning, e.g. if the child has a damaged immune system? So those would all be things that should be part of the conversation. So no decision, you know, should be made in a vacuum. So even though, yeah, DCF has said the EDM is going to make the decision whether it's hybrid, remote, or in person, you know, in a case like that, the expectation would be that the SESP would communicate with all of the collaterals, to make sure that, the right format of learning is chosen. So again, the answer to a lot of these questions, you just make sure that everyone's touching base with one another. But it's a great question, one that kind of gets to the heart of the issue, an educational decision versus a health and safety issue. Lisa Lipinski, how can SESPs collect data on how our students are functioning in remote learning in districts that are 100% remote, in a situation where student lives with a relative but SESP remains decision-making? How does the SESP communicate with home in which the student is living? That are 100% where a student lives with a relative. Geez, I don't know. I mean, that scenario, Lisa, that you're throwing out there isn't one that I'm like really that familiar with. I'd have to kind of check into that. I think the SESP, as the educational decision maker, has a right to, to check in with, in fact, the placement where the student is living. If they're living with a relative, I think that there's no restrictions on, you as the SESP communicating with the relative through DCF to get a sense of about how remote learning is doing. Obviously, as the SESP, you should be in communication with the schools as well. And so if you get a situation like that where there's some question about whether the student is in fact engaging in his or her education through remote learning while living with a kinship placement, definitely, don't feel inhibited to try and like reach out to various people to try and get that answer. So, and certainly don't feel like you're restricted in that. You still are the educational decision maker, but that's a scenario that is probably, it's one that I haven't seen quite a bit.
All right, Jim, we are just about out of time. I do apologize, but it is usually a hard stop. It's going to probably stop us in
that's fine. These are all great questions. Email them to me and I'll get back to you. The spreadsheet should be updated periodically. I mean, I know some of the education coordinators were just working on it recently, Jane. So, that it's a working document. There are other documents that have it as well. So, like the Globe has an ongoing list. I don't know how often they update it. The best, obviously you can check in with the school district. It's on their website. But yeah, it should be updated by the education coordinators.
All right, well,
you guys still there?
Yes. Well, I would just like to thank Jim. Thank you so much for presenting and taking so much time and answering all of these questions, and for providing your email for SESPs and others to reach out to for further questions. I just want to remind everyone quickly just to please fill out those surveys, and we really hope that you check out the rest of the presentations and are really enjoying the conference. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great questions, and thanks for all your hard work on behalf of all of our students. So much appreciated from my end.
Thank you.